So with assignment 4 of week 1, one of the first things we want to kind of talk about is this idea of presentation. A border in between is one of the most basic aspects we want to have. But beyond that, we can have a border around, and that usually provides room to have a description between the low and high key. Something simple of just a half-inch border saying 1 inch all the way around is fine. And I'll add half inch to both sides works. So just adding 1 inch to both of these, and then making sure it's the same color as any other border, so white. And that it's pretty much that simple. If you want it bigger, you can change it. But what I'm going to do next, I'm going to select all, edit, copy, and then image canvas size. And so if I wanted to do a side by side, I could do percent 200 width, and then I'm anchoring it to the left. Hit OK, and this is if I wanted to do comparisons, if I were doing a revision, say for a critique or something, and that's going to be available later on. And so now I have the images side by side, and I can start making comparisons. And I also have the layers this way set up so I can work on one. I could duplicate the layers, so if I was making changes I wasn't so sure about, it would give me the option of going back to the original. Since I'm only going to do this in 5 minutes and it's hit or miss, I'm not going to worry too much about this. So with this top one being low key, one of the things I may want is in a busy image, maybe I don't want to have this be so much contrast that I want to keep this as busy. So what I'll do is lower the contrast between this background elements and the foreground elements. So what I'm going to have happen is I'm going to match these center squares, these diamond shapes, and these other background elements, and I'm going to match them in value. So I can bring in the color window. I'm going to switch it to a grayscale slider. I'm going to turn, as I go to the magic wand, I'm going to turn continuous off, and I'm going to see where that gets me. And it's going to grab a little bit too much, so I'm going to turn it back on. I'm going to grab this background, and I'm not going to probably get it all, but I'll get as much of it as I can in this first selection. I'm going to check the value with the eyedropper of this part. I'm going to check it here. So it's 44 and 36. I'm going to go Control U, and then I'm going to change the lightness of this other part, and I'm going to make it lighter, because what I'm going to do is I'm trying to minimize the contrast in value and hopefully get these closer to where you still see a difference. And since this is the high key, I'm actually going to go lower, but where it's not as dominant as it was before. And so before you saw that it was darker, I don't want to have them be that way. And I'm also going to lower the saturation because I can see already I don't really like that. So I'm going to go ahead and lower the saturation here to give it a little bit more contrast. And now it has the contrast of saturation, maintaining that difference in value that I had, but it's not as significant as before. And what that helps is it has less contrast in the background and allows those foreground elements to have the contrast. And while this isn't going to be perfect, what it ends up doing is allowing the focus to be on these foreground elements. And later on, when we talk about depth, and this is what's going to be important, the fact that I lowered the saturation in the background will allow the background to drop back. Ideally, I would have gone with a darker value in the background to do that, and that would have helped there. So what I did is I paused it, and then I took that background and lowered the saturation. I did push the value back a little bit darker because ideally that's what would have been preferred. I did the same down here. I just moved the selection down here, and then I did the same thing because I was able to push this darker without much consideration. Unfortunately, I also grabbed this area, which I can erase. And then it's also darker as well, which is not a problem because this is low key. And so you can see how that contrast allows these foreground elements to stand out a little bit better compared to the originals. And that's part of using those variations in value and saturation. And this is just a difference in saturation. This isn't much of a difference in value. And if I compare it, it's 43 here, it's 36 here, so that's about 7% difference in value between those two. Here it's 51 and 44, so 7%. I could switch those values down a little bit, but ideally I needed some of that value to create some of the depth. And we'll get to depth later, but it wasn't so much of an issue. If we talked about it in the draft area, I would have recommended the same thing, but not explained it as depth. It would have been explained as contrast.